What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and typically I am analyzing apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. But tonight we're going to be having a discussion on whether or not God exists, or just the premise of God existing or whatnot. And I've got Matthew here. Hi there, Matthew. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. Do you want to take a second and kind of tell my audience, and you're streaming on your channel as well. You don't need to tell your audience who you are, but my audience would probably appreciate knowing who you are, where they can find you, and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah, so I'm a philosophy student. I was an atheist about a year ago, but in the last year I've become a theist based on being convinced by philosophical arguments. I have a YouTube channel called Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, which you should all check out immediately, and a blog called Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's Newsletter. You can find it at benthams.substack.com. The blog I think is even better than the YouTube channel, so they're both, of course, very good. And yeah, I write about various. I write and make YouTube videos about various philosophical subjects. Mostly, sort of, a lot of them are about philosophy of religion, but a lot of them are about other subjects. So yeah, that's who I am. I guess, do you want to, for my audience, because I'm also streaming this on my end. Who are you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm a redneck that has a lot of opinions. I'm the Godless Engineer. Just pretty much all over social media, you can find me as Godless Engineer. I am, in fact, an engineer twice over. I'm an atheist, agnostic atheist to be specific, and I just pretty much make content around that particular topic. I like the history of Christianity, Christian origins, the historical reliability of Christianity, and also the God discussion, which I know is a bit more philosophical, but I kind of peruse all of those areas of the atheist and religion and science sort of topic area.
Cool.
All right. So to get this discussion started, obviously, I'm kind of taking the, I guess, agnostic or agnostic atheist sort of position on this, in that I don't know whether or not like a God in general exists. But if you give me a specific enough definition, then I can probably show how I think that your God I actively don't think that your God exists. So kind of depending on how we want to go with the discussion will change how I argue and stuff. But why don't we start with what convinced you that God is real, and also which God is it?
Well, so I'm a generic theist, so I'm not a Christian or a Muslim nor a Jew. I think that there is a God, but I don't think that the God is the one described by any of the major religions. So I guess that's the answer to which God is it. What I mean by God is I think there's a being that created the universe of unlimited power, knowledge, and goodness. That loves each and every one of us. I sort of have, think the standard things about what people think God is like, minus the more specific bits about, for example, God resurrecting a Jew in first century Roman Palestine. Now, as for the things that convinced me, the things that ultimately convinced me were, as I think is responsible for most cases of changing my mind. It wasn't a single argument, but instead a wide variety of arguments that I thought made the case for theism more plausible than the case for naturalism. One of the ones that moved me, which maybe would be a good one to discuss, some of them are sort of complicated and not good for YouTube, because they get very into the weeds. But I mean, one that that moved me a lot. That makes for an interesting discussion is the fine-tuning argument, where the basic idea, for those who are unfamiliar, is that it turns out that if you look at the laws of physics, the constants that are contained in them, which are the things that you plug into the equations that determine the force of the equations, the constants are finely tuned in the sense that if you tweak them very slightly, no interesting structures of any sort could arise. So, for instance, if the cosmological constant, out of the ranges that the cosmological constant could take on, only about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of them are capable of sustaining any complex structures. If it was a little bit weaker, everything would immediately fly apart. If it was a little bit stronger, everything would immediately collapse in on itself, or maybe other way around. And there are a lot of things in physics that are like this. It's not just the constants, also the laws, also the initial conditions. So I think that the best explanation of why the constants are like this, where they fall in this very narrow range, is that there's a designer who wants to make them able to support complex structures. There's also this more basic conceptual point related to fine-tuning, which is just that it's very unlikely that you'd get any physical system that produces anything interesting at all. If you think about the simplest and most intrinsically probable physical systems, they would, the simplest one would be nothing exists at all. If you have stuff exist at all, the simplest would be it doesn't do anything. And if it does do anything, the simplest thing for it to do would be following these very basic patterns where maybe everything moves in a circle or in a straight line or something, but not producing any interesting complexity. It turns out to be very hard to get a physical system that produces anything interesting. So I think that the fact that our physical system is such as to produce various interesting structures, is such as to, that it gives rise to planets and trees and people and, all sorts of things, rather than just being this boring, dull, lifeless, consciousnessless universe. I think that that's one fact that favors theism, that's more strongly predicted if there's a God than on the alternative. And something is evidence for a hypothesis if it's more likely if that hypothesis is true than if the hypothesis is false.
Okay. Would you say that our concept of physics, like how we understand physics now, wouldn't you say that that's descriptive rather than prescriptive?
Yeah.
Okay. So why is it that physics can only exist in this one configuration?
Wait, why is it that physics? I didn't understand the question. My claim is you could have physics exist in a lot of different configurations.
So what I heard out of your fine tuning thing was just this very dependent idea on physics being the same, and physics being unchanging. And so like here's why that doesn't convince me. Your particular, the fine tuning part of your statement there is that with physics being descriptive of our reality, that just means that if we had a different reality with different constants and different physical processes or whatever, we would just have a different form of physics. Like physics would just be different in a different universe. And so like I don't see how this universe having our kind of physics necessitates that we're the only universe, for one. For two, that physics can only be in this one way. And three, why all of this necessitates that a God must be there in order to fine tune the constants and everything like that.
Okay, so just to be clear, what you're saying is maybe if the laws and if the constants were different, then life could just arise under completely different conditions. It would just be a very different form of life. So I don't think this is true. I think this is wrong both conceptually and it gets the physics wrong. Let me start with how it gets the physics wrong. So if you take, for example, the cosmological constant, if it were stronger or weaker by more than, a teeny amount, if it were more, if it were a little bit stronger, what would happen is after much less than a millisecond, all the particles would fly apart. No, beyond that, no two particles would ever interact in the history of the universe. And if it were a little bit weaker, everything would collapse in on itself, and everything would be an infinitely dense ball. Well, maybe not infinitely, maximally dense ball that remains a ball. Neither of these are conditions that are likely to give rise to life.
Okay, can I? Let me. Sorry, I know that you've got a lot to say, and I don't mean to interrupt your flow here. But given that, I don't see any evidence that hasn't happened. Like our universe didn't do that. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been other universes that have inflated or tried to inflate and just immediately collapsed in on itself. And so I guess to maybe put this in a more analogous sort of setting that maybe explains it a little bit better. Imagine that you have like a whole bunch, like an infinite number of ping pong balls, right? And you lob these ping pong balls at this very ping pong sized hole, like a cylinder, right? And this cylinder is the diameter, like it'll perfectly fit a ping pong ball. If you take an infinite amount of ping pong balls and you just lob them all at the cylinder, there's 100% chance that at least one of those ping pong balls is going to go in there. I guess there's a chance that it just could not. But my point is that if you hurl an infinite amount of them at it, there could be only one particular set of constants that work, but that doesn't mean that all the other ping pong balls don't exist. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense. And in fact, when I was an atheist, that was the preferred response that I went with. And I still think that's the best response that an atheist has. Nonetheless, what we need to do, it's not enough to come up with an explanation of it, right? A young Earth creationist can come up with I'm obviously not a young Earth creationist, but a young Earth creationist can come up with very exotic explanations of every particular fact. If you point to, all the facts, they can say, well, maybe God would have a reason to do it, and they can come up with an explanation. But it's still very strong evidence against young Earth creationism because the probability of the thing they're invoking as the explanation is very low, while the thing that the phenomenon appearing the way it is, if absent young Earth creationism, is much more likely. And so it's very strong evidence. So even if you can come up with an explanation, it isn't enough depending on what the probability is of a multiverse conditional on atheism. And so then we have to see, okay, what is the probability of a multiverse conditional on atheism very high? Well, it turns out I think the answer is no for a bunch of reasons. I'll just present one of them for now. But it's so, the point I raised about fine-tuning, there's the bit about physics that I was describing, but there's also, and what I find more convincing, this more basic conceptual point that only a very, very, very small share of possible sets of laws produce anything interesting. This is a fairly, if you just write a computer program to have stuff move around, it's very unlikely that you'll get it to produce anything interesting. It's certainly very unlikely that you'll get it to spawn a multiverse or to produce interesting and complicated interactions. Famously, there's a game called John Conway's Game of Life where you sort of place down dots and they move around in interesting patterns. In order to get...
I had to... sorry to interrupt your flow. When I was in my bachelor's, I believe, program, I had to write a UI representation of that. But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, so... And what you'll notice, Conway has this, he has 5 rules, and then it makes the dots move around the screen. Conway had to work really, really hard to figure out a system of laws that produce anything interesting, because the vast majority of them don't produce anything interesting. They don't produce dots moving around. They just result in things self-destructing or shooting off into space or something like that. And so even if the atheist can come up with an explanation by invoking a multiverse, the point is the probability of a multiverse conditional on atheism is very low. Now, maybe the idea is there are just a bunch of different universes that exist, none of which have a cause, but then that massively undermines the simplicity of the theory. The only way that you can get a multiverse theory to be simple is by saying that there's one fundamental underlying multiverse universe generator that just generates a bunch of universes. But then that is a bad theory because there's a very low prior probability that you would have something like that generates a bunch of universes. Sorry,
do you think that? Yeah. Do you think that quantum scalar fields are there's a very low probability that they exist?
I don't know what quantum scalar fields are.
Oh, okay. Well, at least the last time that I checked, which science is always advancing, but the last time that I checked, the most likely case for a universe, like how a universe could self-inflate, is by a quantum scalar field fluctuating from a false vacuum state into a true vacuum state. When it does this, we have seen that it releases a huge amount of energy. Think Big Bang kind of thing, how it has this energy that's stored up. Once it fluctuates, it releases this immense amount of energy, and then this energy eventually degrades and transforms, cools into what would eventually become the matter that we have today. So that given that hypothesis, which I admit that it's a hypothesis because that's just one hypothesis amongst a plethora of hypotheses as to how universes can self-inflate in that way. And given this most likely hypothesis, I don't see anything that restricts a scalar field, quantum scalar field, from inflating only once. It seems like there's no restriction at that point. And so any number, an infinite number of universes could self-inflate over some kind of period of time, or however time or any kind of measurement like that would exist outside of a field of space-time.
Yeah, right. So I wouldn't want to dispute that, maybe that is a good theory of physics. Mike, I'm not making a claim about, what the ultimate theory of physics will be like. In fact, I would expect that the ultimate theory of physics will involve it being a multiverse. But the point is, any specific way that you have a physical theory that gives you a multiverse will have a low prior probability. Because for every quantum scalar field that gets you a multiverse, there are so many much simpler worlds where you just have stuff and it sits there doing nothing, or it just moves in a circle, or it just moves in a straight line, or just moves in the shape of a triangle. There are an infinite number of these very, very simple physical patterns that don't produce anything interesting. And so given that, you should think that the prior probability of getting an interesting physical system, if there's no God, is very low. And so the fact that we get an interesting physical system is strong evidence for theism.
Well, so I feel like your position actually has to be that there's a 0% probability.
Why?
Like, why? Well, because just on the basis of how like probabilities and statistics works, even if it's a monumentally low probability of any kind of universe self-inflating, that given enough opportunities or given enough events for it to happen, it will 100% happen.
Oh, I see
So
it.
I feel like your position has to be that there's a 0% probability of it happening. Otherwise, there's 100% probability of it happening. But just because of the nature of it being that we're working with an infinite set here.
Yeah, no, well, my idea was that so you're saying that if every universe has some process, then even if for each particular universe there's a very low probability of it self-inflating, then it's very likely that one of the universes would self-inflate. But what I'm saying is that getting a bunch of universes at all, where some of them self-inflate, where you have an infinite number of universes, that's the thing that has a very low prior probability. So it's and specifically that one has very low prior probability, because if you just say that there are an infinite number of universes that simply exist with no cause, that's a bad theory on account of not being parsimonious. You want to posit the fewest fundamental things. And I just posit one fundamental thing, God.
Well, so no, I mean, I feel like yours actually complicates it a whole lot more because as far as Occam's razor goes, which I feel like that's what you were invoking there, I feel like Occam's razor is more about the least amount of ad hoc claims that you have to base your hypothesis on. And so the fewer ad hoc claims that your hypothesis uses, the more likely it is to be true. And so from my perspective, what I'm doing is I'm taking the available science and the available hypotheses and saying, well, these are the things that we do know. And so what we know about the past is that anytime we've attributed something to a god, regardless of which god it is, every time that we've attributed something to a god, it's always been proven to just be some kind of natural process. So the God hypothesis actually has a lot to overcome. You've got a lot to prove in this particular situation to overcome this prior probability of natural things just being, the actual answer. So with that particular thing in mind, to me, it seems like my hypothesis just uses the available scientific information in order to build a likely scenario of how our universe specifically could have come into existence with the constants and everything like that, with the physics that we experience in reality. It seems like that is, however unlikely, the most likely way that it came about. And unless you're proposing an absolute 0% chance of how that could have occurred and the nature of just infinity in general, like the infinite set that we would be working with prior to our universe or outside of our universe, like I don't see how I don't see like any kind of bounding sorry, I'm trying to think of the word here. COVID's kind of a bitch when it comes to recalling smart words.
Sorry to hear.
I don't see how anything outside of like space time can actually be bounded. So we're working with an infinite set. We're working with an infinite amount of instances for a universe to inflate. And unless you're saying the probability is absolutely 0 for a universe to self-inflate, then more than likely it is going to self-inflate in one way or another.
Let me be clear on what I was saying. I wasn't saying that the probability you have the setup where universes might self-inflate and they're governed by certain laws. I'm not saying the probability of any particular universe self-inflating is 0. or even that the probability of any of them inflating is low. I don't know what the probabilities are. What I was claiming is that the setup where you have an infinite number of universes, each of which is potentially subject to self-inflation, that's the one that has a low prior probability, because that theory posits that there are an infinite number of universes that exist without a cause governed by a complicated series of laws. And the theory that there are infinite things governed by a complicated series of laws is not a good theory, given that there are so many more possible ways that the universe could be, or that the cosmos, the multiverse could be. That's very unlikely that it would happen to be one of the very, very, very narrow slices of probability space where it produces anything interesting. Now, next you suggested that my explanation is worse on Occam's razor grounds. I think it's very good on Occam's razor grounds. What I think Occam's razor is about is the number of fundamental things. So for you don't say, well, we shouldn't think the universe is big because that's ruled out by Occam's razor, because then it has so many more things. As long as the many things in the universe follow from some simple set of laws and initial conditions. So what I think Occam's razor is fundamentally about is the fundamental things, the things that exist without explanations. Now, my claim is there's only one non-composite thing that exists without any explanation. And so so the theory that just that thing exists is a much better theory than the theory that there are laws and they're governed by initial particles and they happen to fall in the very narrow slice of probability space. Now, the last thing you suggested was, well, but in the past, people have gone around suggesting, people have gone around trying to use God to explain everything. Now, I mean, I don't actually think you're correct about, this is sort of a common meme that you hear among atheists, that sort of like, it used to be that people used God to explain everything, but then over time we learned more science, and then the case for God explaining things got smaller and smaller. It's true that the polytheists, they used gods, lowercase g. They thought that there was one God who had a chariot that brought up the sun, one God who would, that there were various things. But the monotheists, they tended not to say, how, of course God exists, because otherwise how could the sun rise? God has to be the one delivering it in a chariot. So it's only the sort of lowercase g God people who thought there were a bunch of different gods that were sort of meddlesome deities interfering in the natural order. Not the sort of the view that was adopted by most Jews and Christians at their purview. But what matters less than what people actually said is what it was reasonable to say. Even if, imagine that just for the last 2,000 years, people had just been randomly going around saying that the Big Bang Theory just explains random things that it didn't explain, right? They say it explains why there are kangaroos. It doesn't, it doesn't explain that, except in a very roundabout sense. They just been saying a bunch of false things. That wouldn't mean that the Big Bang Theory is unreasonable for us to believe today, because what matters is not, it doesn't matter how many times people have irrationally said in the past, God is the best explanation of that fact, if they were mistaken about that fact. Now, I think the only thing that it made sense to use God to explain a long time ago, that it no longer makes sense to use God to explain, is the presence of biological life. I think before discovering Darwin's theory of evolution, that was a great mystery, and that great mystery has been essentially entirely dispelled by the presence of the theory of evolution. But nonetheless, I think the case for God has in one way gotten weaker over time, but I don't think that there's this broad inductive trend of it consistently getting weaker, because I think only one of the powerful pieces of evidence has been dispelled, and many new ones have turned up, like the anthropic argument, like the argument from psychophysical harmony, the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning data was something we only discovered in around 1980. Sorry, I know that was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't see how your particular hypothesis is less ad hoc, because I feel like I'm basing all of my information on what we know about reality, and also taking into consideration things that we don't know. And so, given the things that we do and we don't know, I don't feel like I'm making a lot of assumptions here. Now, I know that you've kind of pushed it from, just the ability to self-inflate to the likelihood that there would be, I guess, a space maybe, or some kind of area of reality to self-inflate, or the probability. Maybe if I'm getting it wrong, you just let me know. Because you did cover a lot.
Just to be clear, what I'm saying is there's some starting point from which it's self-inflated. That starting point contained both physical stuff that existed, namely the universes, the universes that tiled the multiverse, I guess, and laws that governed how it inflated. And my claim is the probability of getting both of those things that happen to produce an interesting structure rather than the vastly more numerous and simpler, just totally boring structures is very improbable.
Well, so I guess I don't understand how you've calculated this likelihood, because I feel like if we drill down into that, maybe I can see where you're coming from. Because like I don't just saying, oh, the likelihood is low is not really explaining to me why the likelihood is low.
Okay, so the reason that the likelihood is low is it's twofold. The first one is, has been fairly well borne out across multiple fields, in order to get an interesting structure, you sort of, you need to work really hard, right? So the same reason that John Conway had to search through and reject a lot of possible sets of laws before he had one that was interesting, because just getting random chaos is just a much more natural and likely state to be in. So first is that result that just, if we look at how difficult it is and how hard you have to search to find interesting structures, then that shows that those are more numerous in probability space than the other one. And then it's especially true if we think about any of the simplest ones. Right? So the simplest laws are nothing happens, very, very simple. Then if we're going to go up for a level of complexity than that, it follows a very, very simple pattern. So maybe everything moves in a line, or maybe it moves in a circle, or maybe it moves in a triangle or a square. The thing these all have in common is none of them produce any complex structures. So all of the simplest laws don't produce anything interesting.
Well, I mean, all of this seems rather arbitrary as to how you're defining complexity and simplicity here, because and also I'm really, I hope that you don't mean this, and I don't mean this in a derogatory fashion, but are you saying that you believe that when the universe self-inflated, it's self-inflated with planets and everything like that, just automatically there? Is that what you don't think that, right?
Wait, I don't understand what you're asking me if I think.
Okay, so in your view, as far as like my explanation goes, do you think that when the universe self-inflated, it self-inflated with planets and stars and all that in it?
No.
Like already existing, already
No,
formed.
right. I mean, planets and stars took a while to develop. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I guess what I'm not understanding here is why you're saying that the universe wasn't simple in the way that you've described when it first inflated. When it first inflated, it inflated, and then it cooled down a little bit, and then I mean, we're talking about like the simplest form of what we would consider matter. It was actually before matter was even there, because it was like it was quarks and shit that were floating around and everything like that. And it took a while for those quarks to even form like the very rudimentary basic components of matter, like protons and neutrons and everything like that. And then it had to get to a point where it was forming atoms, and then the atoms had to get to a point. And so like you're talking about simplicity, but all I'm seeing in my particular world is the very simplest interactions that are occurring and everything like that. And it's not just like it sounds simple to say everything moves in a circle, but when in reality, I think that having that kind of movement in general would actually be a lot more complex in like a practical sense. So I guess that's where I'm coming from on this, because
so when we talk about simplicity, what we're talking about is something like how long it would take using, and there's some technical stuff that I don't understand. There's involving Turing machines, but it's something like how, in some idealized language, how long would it take to fully describe what's happening? Right. So if everything moves in a circle, it's very easy to describe it. You say, just go in a circle. But in contrast, if you have various different laws of physics that describe it doing different things under different conditions, then there's a lower then that's more complicated because it takes longer to describe. And so if you just think about the most simple mathematical formalisms for what the things do, most of them don't produce anything interesting. Now you are saying, well, maybe this whole simplicity thing is a little bit, it's a little bit nebulous and up in the air, and maybe we can't rely on it. I think everyone will have to think that simplicity is at least one of the major things that goes into the choice of what's a better theory. So imagine we have two theories. Okay, theory one is everything will continue according to normal. laws will keep working. Theory 2 is the laws will keep working, except 5 minutes from now, an elephant will appear in my room with no cause. It seems like the second theory is worse, right? And the second theory is worse, even though both theories predict everything I've observed up until this point, because the second theory is more complicated. It predicts an extra thing. And the idea is you shouldn't predict an extra, a theory, even if two theories explain the data. If one of them predicts an extra thing, it's much less likely. The last point is, if what you're saying is, look, maybe the existence of God is sort of on independent grounds very improbable. And so even if it makes it a little bit more likely that you'd get a life-permitting universe, even though it makes it a little bit more likely that you would get fine-tuning, it's independently so unlikely that you should not think that God exists. And I think that's fine. I think in order to see if that's right, we'd have to analyze the broader case for and against God. But no, this isn't my only argument for believing God. This is just one evidential chip in favor of thinking that God exists. And as I was saying before, this is only one of the objections to a multiverse. I think there are about 5 that are pretty good.
Right. Well, so I mean, your example and your description of simplicity there, I feel like it's actually a lot more complicated than what I'm proposing, just because of how I understand like the laws of motion and like just how things move and how like atoms operate, the different things that like form covalent bonds, the reasons why they form covalent bonds, and all this other stuff. Like all of that has very practical and reality based explanations, and I kind of feel like your counter proposals for simplicity here actually involve a whole lot more like complicated things in order to get it to work. Much in the same way that there's classical physics that works here on Earth, and the classical mathematics and describing how things operate here on Earth. But once Newton, needed to describe the orbits of planets and everything like that, he had to invent a whole new, much more complicated physics in order to, or not physics, but calculus in order to describe how those planets move. So like you saying that, moving around in a circle or anything like that is less complicated or is more simple on a very practical and physical level, I don't think that it is. So I guess I just stand in stark contrast to your assumption that like, your explanation for the universe is far more simpler than mine. I feel like mine is based on facts of reality, and we make the best conclusion given the facts that we have, and we do our best not to add presumptions onto it. I'm not saying that there are no presumptions or no ad hoc like statements in it, but I'm just saying that it's the one with the least amount.
Right. So what we want is the simplest fundamental theory that explains the data. So the thing that invokes the fewest fundamental entities and that it explains the data. Now, as for was Newton's theory more complicated than what came before? Well, I mean, as far as I can tell, before Newton, they didn't really have the sort of theory that you could give a precise mathematical description of and measure the complexity of. Right. So, But I mean, I think maybe like Einstein's theory or something was more complicated than Newton's. But right, so it's not just about being simple; it's about being simple and explaining the data. And so, my claim is that, God is this pretty simple thing, just this unlimited mind, and then it explains the data very well. And even if you think there's a pretty low prior probability that there's a God, because it makes fine tuning more likely, and fine tuning is very, very unlikely if there is no God. The presence of fine-tuning is pretty strong evidence for the existence of God. It might be that, look, if it was only the fine-tuning argument, if that was the only argument on the table, I probably wouldn't be a theist, because I would think, the problem of evil and the various arguments for atheism are enough to overwhelm the fine-tuning argument. But I think the fine-tuning argument is enough to at least raise the probability of theism quite a lot relative to what the probability would be if we hadn't observed fine-tuning. Do you at least agree that fine-tuning makes theism more likely than it would otherwise be? Like if we'd never discovered that there's fine-tuning. Okay, you don't. Okay.
No, I don't. And I would have you seen any of the Skydive Field documentaries?
Yeah, I saw them a while ago. I don't really remember the details. I like their Kalam one because I agree. I don't think the Kalam's any good. Um,
Well,
uh,
they have a fine tuning one as well. And so I would suggest taking a look at that because I mean, obviously I'm not an expert like in all of this. You have astrophysicists over there as well as like theoretical physicists and everything like that that Skydive Phil had access to. So I mean, definitely I would suggest looking at the Skydive Phil documentary on the fine tuning argument. I think they have one or two like fairly long documentaries where they address a lot of this stuff. But so
yeah, and I would just say if we're going to be giving recommendations, I would recommend people check out Robin Collins. Well, check out my article called "The Fine Tuning Argument Simply Works" on my blog. That's a good one to check out. But also, I think Robin Collins is very good on the fine tuning argument, and he's very he has various debates online where he's argued with people about it, and he's a philosopher and with a PhD in physics, so worth listening to.
No, that's perfectly fine. I want everybody to have both sides of the argument so that they can make the decision for themselves. I wasn't trying to bogart that, but
I didn't mean to accuse you of nefariously loading the deck in favor.
You're fine. But I do have some questions about your God because you said that you think that it's a simpler, like you're just having to posit one simple thing. And I'm just kind of curious, and this is kind of the question that I have, like, does this God exist outside of time and space? Which I would assume that he would have to, yes?
I'm not super sure. I think there are different views of God's relationship to time, right? So one view that a lot of people have is they say this is William Lane Craig's view, for example. He says that that God is timeless in the absence of creation, but then God enters into time. Maybe that view is right. Maybe God is timeless. Maybe God is in some weird other kind of time. I don't know. I find this all very mysterious. But I find it equally mysterious how you get from a timeless state to a timeful state on atheism. So I don't think this shifts the dice either in favor of either theism or atheism.
Well, I'm just kind of curious because, like, if you shift God outside of time and space, then it becomes a question of how can God do anything if he's outside of time and space? If there's no time for him to like move in or whatnot, how can he actually do anything? And for that matter, how can he think? How can he make the conscious decision to actually make this universe if he exists outside of time and space? And I guess maybe you could posit that there's some kind of special time and space that exists that only God can move and interact in. But I mean, that would just be piling on more ad hoc arguments.
Well, I don't think it would be that ad hoc. Well, so first of all, I mean, I think whatever we're gonna like. It's notable that naturalism is going to have a similar problem, right? So whatever the naturalist says about how the first thing gives rise to time, then the theist, I think, can have a very similar explanation, right? So maybe God's just sort of like infinitely old or something, that at every moment there's a time. God's been around for that entire time. Maybe God is in a special time, the way that various physicists, including some of that mentioned in the Skydive Phil Kalam documentary, I think Linford talked about this, it exists in sort of a non-metric kind of time, a time that has different properties or doesn't work the same way. I think the same problems will face both theism and naturalism, and I think theism maybe has an advantage. I mean, you're asking like, how can God think outside of time? I mean, I don't really know. Like, I don't know what's impossible. Like, I don't see anything impossible about God thinking outside of time, and I don't expect the intuitions that we have based on our sort of limited sense data in a world that is where time does apply we wouldn't have any reliable intuitions about what things are like in the absence of time and with conscious beings. I just think this is the sort of thing that we shouldn't trust our intuitions about. By the way, I have more objections to the multiverse response to fine tuning. If you want to talk about them, or we could shift to a different subject. Either one's fine.
Well, I mean, as far as like your arguments for God or the things that convinced you about God, we have the fine tuning argument is one. So I guess maybe what's the next one?
Okay. I can tell you this one moved me the most, and it's a very confusing argument. But But I think it's a very convincing argument, and it's a little weird. And it's called the anthropic argument. The basic idea is so remember the God that we're talking about is this perfect being. Okay, so here's this plausible principle. It's good to create stuff. Like creating beings. If you give them a good life, if they have an infinitely good life on the whole, it's good to create them. That seems at least minimally plausible. I think it's overwhelmingly plausible, but it's at least not terribly unlikely. So
was it good for God to create Jeffrey Dahmer?
Well, so it's not the case that every single instance of creating someone is good. Now, my claim would be that Jeffrey Dahmer will sort of like have an infinitely good afterlife after undergoing some process of trial and tribulation where he eventually repents of his wicked ways. Right. So while his existence
he already
is
did.
Okay, if he seriously repents, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say, but before he died, he repented. He turned to Jesus Christ, which I know that you don't believe in, but he apparently repented.
I think Jesus was a person, unlike you, but that's a topic for another day. And not a topic I've spent very much time reading about. Yeah. So okay, if he eventually turned away from his wicked ways, then I think creating him would be good insofar as both he and all his victims end up living this infinitely good afterlife, infinitely far into the future after having their characters reformed. But I mean, you don't actually have to say that every particular individual person whose existence is good. All you have to think is that it's good for God to create a lot of people, right? To create many infinite people. Maybe just an unfortunate consequence of creating a bunch of people in a world like ours is that he has to make some, people like Jeffrey Dahmer. But all you need for the argument is there's at least a not terrible probability that God would create some huge infinite worth of people, because it's good to create a person. And so God, after he creates, at least, in lots of cases, after he creates, one universe, he has no reason to stop after that point. He could keep going. Okay. So not terrible probability that God would create some huge infinity worth of people. Then the next claim is that there's a view in anthropic reasoning. Anthropic reasoning is how you reason about your own existence. So, when people talk about the anthropic principle, that's an instance of anthropic reasoning. There's a view in anthropic reasoning where the idea is that if there are two theories, and one theory says that there are more people that I might currently be by a factor of n, that theory is n times more likely. So here's a simple case to illustrate. Suppose a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person gets created. And if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. Suppose I get created from this process. On the self-indication assumption, tails would be 10 times likelier than heads, because it's 10 times likelier that I would come to exist if there were 10 times as many people. So I claim the self-indication assumption is correct. I've given, over the course of various articles, I've given about 30 arguments for the self-indication assumption. I'll give some more in a moment, but first I want to finish laying out the argument, because I actually think it all hinges on the self-indication assumption. But I claim, look, the self-indication assumption is correct. And, it's not some weird fringe theory. It's a lot of philosophers think it's right. But so if the self-indication assumption is correct, and a theory that says that there are n times as many people as another is rendered n times more probable, then from this, you should think there are infinite people. And in fact, not merely any infinite of people, but however many people are possible, you should think that's the number of people that exist, right? Whatever the number of possible people is, the infinite of people that exists is that same number. Because that predicts infinitely more people than any other hypothesis, according to which there's a smaller infinite of people or only a finite number of people. Then, once you conclude this, so we've concluded, number one, if there is a God, it's very likely that some huge infinity worth of people would be created. If there is no God, then it seems very unlikely that there would be a huge infinity worth of people being created. The number of the infinity representing the number of possible people is for some sort of technical reasons that I'd be happy to go into. It's not the number of people that you could have in an infinitely big universe, right? You need a multiverse to get that many people, right? So from this, we conclude there's this infinitely big multiverse. And then the claim is the best explanation of why there would be this infinitely big multiverse is that there's a God, because if there's a God who finds, and it's good to create, then God would be expected to create some huge infinity worth of people. While in atheism, it's very improbable that there would be a huge infinity worth of people. That was the very brief Cliff Notes version of it. If people are curious, on my blog, I have an article called The Best Argument for God, where I lay this out in much greater detail. And the argument sounds weird. There are a lot of obvious objections that appear at first, but my claim is that all the objections that you're sort of immediately thinking of right now, none of them work, and I address them in various places. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe my brain got tripped up at the very beginning when you said that it's good to create a lot of people, right? And then at the end you said that whatever is the infinite or the maximum possible number of people to create, that would be the number that God would create. Is that correct? Am I understanding that right?
So, sort of. It's not necessarily God would create the maximum possible. Like it's not necessarily the case that God would create every single possible person. It's the case that you can have two infinites that are the same cardinality, which means you can pair the members one to one. The claim is that whatever the number of possible people there are, people that God would create would be the same cardinality as that. So it would be the same size infinity, even if it's not exactly the same people. So maybe God wouldn't create every possible person, just the number of people he would create would be the same size infinity as yeah.
Yeah. So my first thought is, so that means that God's not all powerful, which I don't know if that's part of your definition of God.
Why? I think God is all powerful. Why do you think it means that?
I mean, if God is limited by a specific number of people that he can create, and not the entire swath of possible people that he can create, that seems to be a limiting factor.
I was saying God would be able to create all possible people. I was just saying maybe God wouldn't have maybe God wouldn't have a reason to create all right. So maybe, and this gets into some other thing, some more. I'm actually inclined to think God would create all possible people, but maybe you think that there are people who are essentially very, very wicked, depending on exactly what you think of personal identity, right? So maybe God couldn't have made Ted Bundy as a nice person. He couldn't have made some horrible serial killer in a different universe where they're a nice person. Right. It depends on exactly what you think about how personal identity works across worlds. But my point is just God would create at least a number of people equal to the cardinality of the set of possible people.
Okay. So what?
Or at least it's not terribly improbable.
Do you posit this limiting factor as far as how many people are possible?
So I don't know if there are different. I think you can show a plausible lower bound on the number of possible people. So the number of possible people. Okay, so the smallest infinity is called Aleph null, and then the infinity an infinity that's bigger than that is Beth 1, and then an infinity bigger than that is Beth 2. You can show pretty conclusively that there are at least Beth 2 possible people, because if the world is arranged of points, then there would be Beth 1 points, and there are Beth 2 ways of arranging Beth 1 points. So it's definitely at least Beth 2. Now, is it more than that? Maybe it's completely unlimited, right? Maybe it isn't even a set. You can't even construct a set out of it. That's actually what I'm inclined to think. But the argument, it doesn't rely on anything contentious about exactly how many possible people there are. It only needs to claim that it's a lot. At least Beth 2. Actually, even Beth 1 would certainly be enough, because there's no plausible atheistic story about how you get Beth 1 people either. Well, there is a plausible theistic story about how you get Beth 1 people.
When you say people, do you just mean organisms in general, or are you talking about sentient beings?
Sentient beings. I mean, the same points will apply to both organisms and sentient beings.
Okay, so this maximum number is just organisms and not just people.
Yeah, I think there are Beth 2 caterpillars as well.
So there's the same number of caterpillars as there will be of people in human history.
To be clear, I'm not saying they're all on our planet. I'm saying they're spaced out across the multiverse. So my claim is that in total in the multiverse, there will be the cardinality of the number of caterpillars will equal the cardinality of the number of people. The cardinality, that tells you the size of different infinities.
Okay. So so here's my question. If it's good to create a lot of people, right? Why is it that most of our universe is inhospitable to life? Wouldn't it make sense for God to create a universe that's full and teeming with life, but yet we don't find that?
Okay, so let me make 2 points about that. The first one is that, and this is a really weird consequence of infinity, but it happens to be true. It isn't actually the case that, so suppose our universe is infinite in size, which it seems like probably it is. That seems to be what our best physics points to. It actually turns out that if the universe is infinite in size, and there are 2 possibilities. Possibility 1 is that there are 100 civilizations per galaxy. Possibility 2 is that there's 1 civilization every million galaxies. They actually have the same number of civilizations. And the way to see this is that it's a little bit tricky to describe. This is an entirely uncontroversial result among mathematicians, because the idea is that 2 infinites are the same size if you can pair them 1 to 1. So if you can take each member of one of them and match them with a member of the other. And the idea is that, so let's say they're arranged from left to right. Well, in both cases, you could keep pairing them 1 to 1 by pairing the leftmost universe with the one here with the one here, the one here with the one here. You could pair them 1 to 1, right? So it isn't actually the case that if the universe had a denser distribution of people, that it would have any more people. And that's a very weird consequence of infinity, but it happens to be true. The second point is that my claim is God creates God, there's some collection of people who's worthwhile to create, and then God creates them all. And so if that's true, it doesn't really matter how they're distributed, right? Because he just makes them all. It doesn't matter if he puts how many of them he puts in our universe versus in other universes. He makes them all, so it doesn't. Yeah. So the comparative non-density of our universe isn't a problem.
Well, so what I'm suggesting is that if it's good for God to create people, then it seems like, from what we can tell, at least looking out into the cosmos and everything like that, we are pretty much the only ones in our local sector or whatever. I mean, it seems like if that were the case, then God would have created, organisms on multiple different planets that could potentially support life. So, I mean, granted, as far as we know, we haven't seen any other organisms, we haven't interacted with any other organisms, but it seems to me like if your particular hypothesis would pan out, then we should easily be able to detect other people. On your hypothesis, why is it that we can't?
Yeah, well, I was explaining that. So the idea is that, first of all, your idea is that if there were more detectable civilizations near ours, then
Well,
your idea.
no, so sorry. My idea is, if God thinks that it's good to create a lot of people, then it follows that God should fill the universe with life in some kind of fashion, and we don't see that. So why is that?
Right. So my 2 responses to that are: first, there aren't actually any more people just because the universe is more densely filled. Because if there's an infinite universe, then it doesn't matter how densely populated the universe is; it has the same number of people. In the sense that, so let's imagine, so here, like, suppose that there are infinite civilizations. So suppose that there are infinite people in the universe, or infinite civilizations, and they're all spaced really far apart. Just by moving them all closer to each other, we would increase the density of them. But that wouldn't make any more people, because when you have 2 infinites, the size of them isn't determined by how dense things are across it. The size of them is determined by cardinality, by the extent to which you can pair them with other things. Right? So it wouldn't actually be the case that if it were denser, there would be any more people. And I know this is a sort of tricky idea to get your head around, but it's true nonetheless. The second point is that even if you think it would be denser, my claim is that God, in the multiverse, God makes every possible person, right? So all the people who he might make, on the next planet over, those people already exist. They exist elsewhere. They exist elsewhere in the multiverse. And so if God already makes all possible people, then his love of people doesn't affect how they'd be distributed, right? All it tells us is that he'd make a lot of people, not how he would distribute the people that he makes.
I mean, I get it from a theoretical sense that you're talking about here, but from a very practical sense, that just doesn't make sense. I mean, like, for instance, with the universe that we're currently existing in, like, we know that there's a bounded amount of energy that this universe had, and that the clock has been running down since the inflation of this universe. We know that there's a total amount of energy in this universe, and we know that we are going to run into a heat death of this universe where no work can be done, and that energy has reached its equilibrium, And so we know this. We know this. We also have really good indications of the shape of the universe, like whether or not it's flat or curved. And so, like, we have this idea about like how much stuff is in the universe, and it's bounded. And so, for you to say, "Oh, it doesn't matter if God creates one amount of people versus a much greater amount of people," that it literally doesn't make sense. And on a very practical application of this whole idea, it definitely matters, because where it matters is that we are actually going to run into organisms from other worlds. We should actually, if it's good for God to create as many people as he can, then regardless of whether or not the amount of people changes or anything like that, we should still already have run into another species that exists on a different world.
But I
Like,
think maybe you're not understanding my response, because what you're saying is that if it's good to create people, then we would expect the universe to be densely populated with lots of civilizations if there's a God, and then we run into them, and then we don't see that, so that's wrong. And I was giving two reasons why that isn't correct. The first one is that there aren't actually any more people. Just if you have an infinitely big universe, which I think ours probably is, and I think the argument gives us reason to think ours is. If you have an infinitely big universe, and we have an independent reason, I think, to think ours is infinitely big. If you have an infinitely big universe, then the number of people there are is not determined by how densely situated the civilizations are in the universe. Because if in an infinitely big universe, you could make them more dense by just having them all move towards each other. But that wouldn't increase the number of people. You wouldn't get any new people. What determines the size of infinite sets is the cardinality, whether you can put them into correspondence with each other. It's not this stuff about whether like how densely populated the universe is, right? This stuff is all irrelevant to size. And then the second point is, you're saying, well, God would make them very densely populated. My point is, if God makes them all, then he has no reason to make them especially densely populated. He could if he wanted to, or he could not if he didn't want to.
So I guess the fundamental difference between us right now is this whole idea of the universe being infinite. You think that there's good reason to think it. I think that we can only perceive, at least we can only detect things 13.8 billion years in the past, which seems to be the 300,000 years or so after the inflation of this universe. So why is it that you think that it's infinite? And also, what do you mean by infinite? Do you mean like there's an infinite amount of energy in this universe, or do you mean that there's an infinite amount of stuff in this universe, or that there's an infinite area for this universe to expand into?
I mean the first ones, that there's an infinite amount of stuff in the universe. So suppose you want, so like here's an easy way to
definitely not true.
No, that's not. I think you're wrong about the physics.
No, I mean, it's definitely not true. We can only perceive things, right? The detectable universe is only 13.8 billion light years.
You're talking about the
away.
observable universe, but that doesn't tell us how big the unobservable universe is. And if the universe is flat,
and
then
we don't
the unobservable
know.
universe has to be infinite. Well, my claim is that we do know. I mean, first of all, there is some evidence from physics, and I couldn't describe it in detail. I'm not a physicist. I don't pretend to be. Unlike Craig, I don't go bandying about the Borde-Guthun-Vilanken theorem or other physics things that I don't understand. But maybe that was an unfair cheap shot. Anyways, sorry, digression. Yeah, so I think we do know. I mean, first of all, there seems to be evidence from physics for it, where what physicists say is that if the universe is flat, then this means that it must be infinite. And then they've measured that the universe is either flat or very, very, very near flat. Right? So this tells us that the universe is either infinite or very near infinite, or like this is evidence that it's infinite. But then second of all, and this is the more important point, the argument I've given, so I argued that the self-indication assumption is correct, where the idea of the self-indication assumption is that if there are more people, then it's it's higher probability that you would come to exist. If there are n times as many people, it's n times as likely that you would come to exist. If this is right, then your existence alone just gives you infinitely strong evidence that there are infinite people. Now, the self-indication assumption is a sort of weird view. But I think it's supported by a lot of different very strong arguments. I've given about 30 in total on my blog, but I'll just list one of them. So let's imagine the following setup: one person gets created, and then a coin is flipped, and if it comes up tails, 999 other people are created. So suppose you get created, and you don't know if you're the first person or a later person. If you reject the self-indication assumption and don't think your existence is likelier if there are more people, then you'd think that the probability of the proposition the coin comes up heads being true equals the probability of the proposition the coin comes up tails being true. Right? Because in both cases, you don't know. You have no evidence either way, because more people existing doesn't make your existence more likely. Then suppose that you learn that you're the first person. Well, if the coin comes up tails, it's only a 1 in 1,000 chance that you'd be the first person. What's guaranteed if the coin comes up heads? So now you get a 1,000 to 1 update in favor of the coin coming up heads, which means that now you're confident at 1,000 to 1 odds, and it could be made to be infinity to 1 odds by changing the numbers, that a coin that you haven't flipped yet will come up heads, based on the fact that if it comes up tails, a bunch of people will be created. And I claim this is wrong. You shouldn't think that. So if the self-indication assumption is right, then your existence alone gives you infinitely strong evidence that there are infinite people. And so my idea is, look, your existence alone gives you infinitely strong. Your existence alone gives you infinite. There are an infinite number of people, and then the best explanation, and not just a small infinite, a really big infinite of people. And then my claim is, look, the best explanation of this is theism, because God would be decently likely to create it, while there's no plausible atheistic story of how that would happen.
Okay. Sorry. So you don't think that there's going to be a heat death, or that do you think that entropy is real?
Yeah. And I'm not denying a heat death, nor am I denying entropy.
But okay, so
let me be clear. I at no point am denying any bit of what was told to us about the universe by our best scientific theory. I'm not a young Earth creationist. I don't deny entropy. I don't deny any of this stuff. I believe what standard science tells us about the world.
Right. I'm trying to suss out like your idea here, because like the idea of an infinite universe or am I wrong in that particular assumption? Like, is it an infinite universe but a finite amount of energy for this infinite universe to run on?
No, I think it would be an infinite universe and an infinite energy spread across the universe.
Then how can a heat death occur?
Well, I think the way heat death would, and to be clear, the things I'm saying are not like I'm not going against what physicists are saying about an infinite universe. I mean, I think the way heat death would occur is that so when we talk about a universe expanding, a universe can expand even if it's infinite, because what we mean when we say a universe is expanding is that any 2 points are getting further apart. So if you have 2 points here, they go like that, right? And so that means, eventually things will be spread out in uniform and no longer interacting, even though at no point even though the total degree of entropy is infinite.
Okay, now the part that I'm focusing on with entropy is the fact that there's an infinite amount of energy, right? If there's an infinite amount of energy, how can a heat death occur? That's what I'm confused about. Like, if there's an infinite amount of energy, then I mean, will a heat death ever occur?
Yeah, sorry, what's supposed to rule out a heat death occurring? Like, it's an infinite amount of energy, but it's spread across an infinite space. So I'm not sure why that's supposed to rule out a heat death.
Yeah. Well, because of how entropy works. I mean, right now there's like a running clock in the universe, right? Of how much energy is available to do work, and then there's also an amount of energy that's been degraded to the point where no more work can be done. And essentially, what the heat death of the universe is when that reaches equilibrium and no work can be done anymore. My question is that if there's an infinite amount of energy in the universe, how can we ever get to, like, I understand how in an infinite amount of energy, how we can be at any one point, but how can it actually run down to heat death if there's an infinite amount?
Wait. I mean, maybe I think I'm not understanding what's supposed to be impossible about this. But I mean, like, I mean, I think you'd probably have to talk to a physicist about the details of this. The things I'm saying are not things that are like this is not like some fringe view in theory that about physics that I made up from the armchair. And in fact, if it turns out that the universe is finite, that wouldn't impact the argument very much. It wouldn't really impact the argument at all, right? Because the argument, the thing the argument established, multiverse. It doesn't tell us about, and in fact, a very large infinite multiverse, larger than the sorts of things that you can plausibly get on an atheistic model. Right. So I guess maybe I need. I'm not quite sure on what you're saying about the entropy stuff. I think you'd probably need to talk to a physicist about it in more detail. It's possible that I'm misstating the physics.
Well, I think a physicist would not say that there's an infinite amount of energy in the universe, is what I think a physicist would probably tell me.
I don't think that's right. I think that I'm pretty sure that the view that is adopted by many physicists who think that the universe is flat is that sort of like, if you look at what's happening in our local region of space where, there's stars and planets and so on and so forth, that just keeps going forever. I think that's a standard view. It's possible I'm wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. That's not hugely consequential to the argument. It's just a way of illustrating the point where you are saying, well, why wouldn't God make more people? And I'm saying, well, if the universe is infinite, then changing the density doesn't actually change the number of people.
But I mean, I understand the nature of infinities, but what I'm saying is that if it's good for God to create, maybe we can move on from this point because we are kind of like just going in a circle here. For me, if it's good for God to create as many people as he can, then it seems like it would be good for God to densely pack the universe with people and not have planets and everything.
But that's assuming that a densely packed universe has more people. And my claim is that if the universe is infinite, a densely packed one doesn't actually have more people. But anyways, I mean,
I think that God should densely pack the universe as much as he can, so that it whether or not it's more people or not, we should still be able to see this in practical reality. But
sorry, so why do you think God would pack the universe densely? Because it sounded like the reason you were saying
it's good for God to create as many people as possible.
But my claim is that a more densely packed universe, if it's infinite, doesn't actually have more people, because the way you determine the sizes of infinities is not looking at the density and things like this; it's looking at cardinality.
Yes, but from a practical point of view, you can make a universe with a certain set of people, and then you can make a universe with a bigger set of people. And like from a practical standpoint, instead of this theological sort of or not theological, but theoretical standpoint, like there's a practical difference in the amount of people that we're talking about here. I get that you think that the universe is infinite.
Sorry, just to be clear, I don't think. Well, yeah, I don't think there's a practical difference in the number of people. Right. So here's one way to see this. Imagine that you have infinite people and they're spread across a bunch of galaxies packed further apart. Right. So so one of the galaxies. So it's one person, then one civilization, then 99 more galaxies, and then another one, then 99 more galaxies, and another one.
Why would God create the 99 galaxies in between the two people?
Well, sorry, let me just finish explaining the thought experiment. And then you get rid of the 99 intermediate galaxies, right? They're just destroyed. All the stuff is sucked together, so the other galaxies go away. Do you think that there are now more people, even though you haven't added a single other person, just because it's now denser?
No, but it makes no sense for God to create those 99 galaxies between one civilization and another civilization. That seems to be a very imperfect thing to do.
Okay, no, so you're saying it's a bad thing to do because having it be more spread apart means that there are fewer people. And I'm saying, well, this is very
inefficient. It's inefficient for God to do that. Why would God create a planet that cannot support life?
Well, so I don't think that it's obvious one way or the other what God would do in regards to this. I don't think God has a very compelling reason to make them more densely populated, nor does God have a very compelling reason to make them less densely populated, because in both cases, it's the same number of people. The density of the population does not tell you anything about the number of people. But maybe we should move on because I don't think we're making very much progress here. I guess I could talk about. I mean, the problem is it is annoying to talk about it because most of the arguments that move me to think there's a God are like this one where they're particularly niche and complicated. But I mean, I could talk about the moral knowledge argument. That one might be simpler to describe.
Moral knowledge? That's more in my wheelhouse, I guess.
Sure.
But I mean, shoot.
Yeah.
For
So
the moral argument.
yeah. Okay. So let me first be clear. I am not making the standard moral argument where people say if there's no God, then there are no objective values and duties, but there are objective values and duties, so God exists. The argument is
that would be dumb to do.
Yes, I agree. I think that's a very bad argument. If people are curious, I have an article called "Why I Don't Buy the Moral Argument" that explains a bunch of reasons why I think it's a very bad argument. And in fact, I actually think that argument has negative force, because if you're convinced that if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties, then you should be an atheist, right? Because then that means that I don't think God is capable of grounding objective morality, and so theism entails moral. If God can't ground objective morality and moral realism would be false absent God, then just theism is necessarily false. But the argument, it's not about the existence of the moral facts, it's about how we come to know them, right? So the idea is, look, so if you think that the way we come to know the moral facts, and this is not just about the moral facts, the same point will apply to mathematical facts or modal facts or facts about a whole range of other things, is, our beliefs come and are mediated through the physical processes that go on in our brain. Well, here's a plausible principle. Suppose that the reason that you think X has nothing to do with the fact that X is true. So, for example, I think that there's a table in front of me, but it turns out that I'm hallucinating a table. I know that I'm hallucinating a table, right? So my vision, the fact that I see a table has nothing to do with whether there's a table in front of me. And it seems like at that point, I don't have justification for thinking that there's a table, because the reason why I think there's a table has nothing to do with the fact that the table actually exists. So if this is right, then given that moral facts, like the fact that suffering is bad, for example, the fact that justice is the type of thing worth pursuing, these are not the sorts of things that are capable of moving around atoms in our brain. And so if this is true, then if all of our moral beliefs come from our brain, rather than come from some non-physical faculty of intuition, then we shouldn't trust our moral beliefs. Our moral beliefs are, they're not reliable. And so then the idea is, if we have moral knowledge, then that's very strong evidence for the existence of God, because if moral knowledge requires that our moral beliefs track the truth, if there's a God, you'd expect them to track the truth. But if there is no God, then it would be just a huge coincidence if our moral beliefs line up with what turns out to be objectively true.
Okay. I mean, I feel like the biggest problem with this is the fact that our moral knowledge has changed so much over the centuries, since human existence ever came about. How do you explain this change in moral knowledge?
I explain it the same way I explain the change in our scientific knowledge, the same way I explain the change in our mathematical knowledge. Over time, we learn more things, and we come to new conclusions about the way things are, about what things are like. And so, as we learn more, we learn various moral facts. We learn that slavery is wrong, and we just like we learn scientific facts, like that the Big Bang happened.
Okay. So, slavery. Since you brought up slavery, I mean, what I heard in your explanation for how the moral argument proves that God exists is that the fact that our moral knowledge seems to represent truth. Is that right?
Yeah, I think we know certain things about morality, like we know that slavery is immoral.
Now,
I think it was immoral before. We just didn't know it at the time.
Right. We didn't know it, but everybody thought that it was perfectly fine. So, like,
just like a lot of people used to think the Big Bang didn't believe in the Big Bang, but that doesn't mean that there was no Big Bang. It just meant that people were wrong.
Well, right, but I also don't think that knowledge comes from God. That's the big differing thing here, is that, like, for me, moral knowledge is not representative of, like, reality or truth or anything like that. I feel like it represents this ever moving goalpost of how best to live as a social species, how to survive and thrive and everything like that in a complex social environment. I think that, we do learn and change over time, but that's just because we learn to live with each other and survive and thrive better. But none of this includes a God. None of this points to a God. This is all subjective human experience. If what you're saying is correct, then we should see a standard of morality across time, cultures, and I guess universes, since we're talking about multiple universes. We should see like a standard, but we don't.
Uh, so I agree that the argument assumes that morality is objective. Though actually, as I'll explain in a moment, I think the argument it can be made about other things like our mathematical knowledge or our knowledge of the reliability of induction. So it doesn't actually require commitment to moral realism. But it's easiest to see with morality, right? So you're saying, well, the argument it assumes that morality is objective, but if so, we would see it or something. I mean, so the reason I think morality is objective is that if something seems to you a certain way, you should trust that it is that way unless you're given a reason to doubt it. Upon seeing a table in front of you, you should think that there is a table in front of you unless you're given a reason to doubt it. And if you don't think this, then we basically have no basis for all of our moral beliefs. But then there are lots of things about morality.
Okay. So running with that, Jeffrey Dahmer thought that it was perfectly fine to eat another person. Does that mean that it was morally justified in eating another person?
So the claim is not that whatever you think is morally right is right. The claim is about how we come to have knowledge about morality. And the claim is that if something seems right to you, in the absence of a reason to reject it, you should think that it's the case. And so with Jeffrey Dahmer, well, first of all, I mean, I assumed, I don't think Jeffrey Dahmer thought that eating people was moral. He just didn't care about the moral facts. But second of all, I mean, maybe he did, but then I would just say he wasn't justified because he had good, he had defeaters. You're justified in this unless you're given a good reason to doubt it. I think there are various good reasons to doubt that it's right to kill people, right? So maybe if it seems right to you, you get a little bit of
this does not occur to a lot of people, though.
Yeah, but I don't think I mean, maybe it doesn't occur to people, but I mean, so what? Like,
I mean, I'm not the one that's saying that, if there's good reason to doubt it, unless there's good reason to doubt it, then you should just take it as being morally true. And so, like for Jeffrey Dahmer, he didn't see any kind of reason why he shouldn't eat a motherfucker.
Well, can I ask you? So let's give an analogy with your visual experiences, right? So you think there's an external world, I assume. You think like I exist, other people exist. There are trees and tables and chairs. How do you think you know that if it's not based on a default trust in the way that things appear?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Like, how do you know that there's an external world, for example? Because my claim is that the way that you come to know that there's an external world is by relying on the way that things appear, where, you're going to say, well, it's an external world. It's a simpler explanation, and it seems like simpler explanations are more probable, or we should have a default trust in the way things look. But then my claim is that the same sorts of considerations will apply to morality, where they will also give you a reason to think that morality is objective.
Right. I mean, I interact with it like my senses, like I don't know, like my senses detect the real world and everything like that. Like I just that's my experience. I'm not trying. I really don't want to get into like a discussion on solipsism.
Okay. Right. So. I mean, right. So I know these discussions, they can get a little bit annoying and in the weeds, but I guess I'll just say that I think that the same sorts of things that you're saying about that explain how we are confident that solipsism is false, explain how we know that there are moral facts, where the idea is that, you're saying, well, we detect it, we interact with the external world, but, you could imagine that maybe what we're detecting isn't the external world and we're just hallucinating. All these things are possible, but the point is you actually need a reason to think they're the case, because you should have a default trust in the way that things appear. But if you should have a default trust in the way that things appear, then if it intellectually appears to you that, for example, it's wrong to torture babies and that the wrongness of torturing babies doesn't depend on what anyone thinks of it, and it certainly appears that way to me, then you should think it's that way. But I guess, I mean, the argument
doesn't apply to everybody, though. Like the things that you're talking about don't apply to everybody. Not everybody knows that it's not a good thing to like torture another person. Some people take joy in it. Those would be psychopaths. Sociopaths just wouldn't give a shit. So like the things that you're saying are heavily dependent upon everybody's neurochemistry operating exactly the same, and that's just simply not how it happens.
Well, but I'm not claiming, my claim is not that everyone has justification for knowing all the moral facts. My claim is that, I have justification for knowing all the moral facts, and that there are true moral facts. So imagine I said this to you. I say, look, imagine you're a young Earth creationist. You think that the Earth is 6,000 years old. I say to you, no, this is so implausible. You date the bone, you date the fossils, and they're much older than that. You date rocks. Blah, blah, blah. I go give all the arguments, and you say to me, well, but there are many people who don't know these things. That's true, but the fact that there are many people who don't know these things is irrelevant to whether that doesn't tell us whether you have a good justification for believing it, nor does it tell us whether the thing is true. It just tells us that there are some people who are ignorant of it.
I mean, I don't know. I still can't get past the fact that morals and morality is inherently subjective. What occurs to one person to be either morally good, bad, right, or wrong is going to be different on a per person basis. And I get that you have a particular view and you have particular moral judgments that you can make about things, but that doesn't mean that that should or does extend to other people.
So you're asserting that morality is subjective, right? But you're not really giving a reason. You're just sort of asserting it. And now you're saying, well, but
I can assert why morality is subjective. It's because of how our brains work. It's how social species work. The neurochemistry of people works differently depending on what psychological factors are affecting them. Like, I can give you like a ton of reasons out my ass as to why it would be subjective.
Well, that doesn't tell us anything about whether it's subjective. That might describe how that people disagree about it, that people form their beliefs in different ways, and you can tell the story about how we come to believe the things we do about morality. But I'm not denying any of that. I agree that people disagree about morality. When you say something's subjective, you mean that its truth doesn't depend on what people think about it. And so describing various facts about the belief-forming process, that doesn't tell us anything about whether it's subjective. Though, I mean, maybe... to be clear, I don't think the argument actually depends very much on whether morality is objective, because the same sorts of things that I'm saying, you can also apply to lots of other subjects. So, for example, I mean, I assume you think the sun will rise tomorrow, right? You think we can trust induction. We can trust that the way things have worked in the past, they'll continue working. The basic laws will continue working the same way into the future. But note...
Yes, I adhere to uniformitarianism, yeah.
Yeah. So note that it turns out that if the world is such that the laws of nature will change tomorrow, you right now would have exactly the same beliefs as you do. Well, if the laws will be completely different tomorrow, right? So then given that, it's hard to see how, unless you think that if you accept the principle that if the reason that you believe X is on the basis of evidence Y, and the reason, let's think about it better. Okay, if you suppose you believe something A because of B, but it turns out that B, the reason why B is the case doesn't depend on A. So, for example, you believe there's a table because you see it, but you'd see the table even if there wasn't a table because you're hallucinating. Then you don't have justification for believing in the table, right? So if you don't think that right, so if the reason why you have your inductive beliefs has nothing to do with the fact that they're true, then that undermines your justification for them. But the point is, whether or not the sun will rise tomorrow, we'd have the exact same inductive beliefs. So unless you think that we have some non-physical faculty of intuition that gives us direct access to which states of the world are more probable to exist, then you don't have any justification for trusting induction. And sorry, if that was more confusing, we could go back to the moral knowledge one. Happy to discuss either. But yeah, this one might be a way.
I understand that. I just don't know how any of that actually, solidifies that, like, there's this absolute moral knowledge and we're just only randomly gaining access to it, like, and that this somehow proves a god. Like, I guess I'm just not seeing the connection here, because for me, what I see is that our moral knowledge evolves over time because we figure out slowly what is the best way to work as a social species and to work together to survive and thrive. Like, that is just how things work. I don't see where God fits into that. That's where I'm not making the connection here.
Right. So if all you think of morality as being is just descriptive set of norms about how social species thrive, okay, then God isn't really needed. Well, my point is that, I think that our moral norms, they're not just sort of pragmatically useful, but we happen to be right about them, right? So even if it was very efficient,
How do you know you're right?
The survival of our social species for us to go around torturing and enslaving people, it would still be immoral. You shouldn't do that. Now, the reason to think that you shouldn't do that, well, as I've described, I think our basic justification for our beliefs comes from appearances. So what you do is you start with the way things appear, and then you modify them based on the deliverances of other appearances and based on other reasons to doubt them. And so it appears that it appears very, very strongly that there are certain things about morality. And what we want to do is we want to sort of form those beliefs into a coherent web so that they don't contradict and they make sense with each other. So the reason why I think, for example, that it's wrong to go around torturing people is it seems to me that it's wrong to go around torturing people. And I think that you should trust that things are the way that they appear unless you're given a good reason to doubt it.
Okay, yes, which is good for you, and I agree. It's bad to go around torturing people, but like this is not this does not translate to other people in society that suffer from various psychological conditions like psychopathy and sociopathy. How do you explain those people on this whole moral knowledge argument? Like, how does let me ask this a different way. How does this moral knowledge that these people seem to lack, how is that evidence that God exists?
Well, the idea is that the idea is, one, we have moral knowledge, and then two, if there is no God, then the probability of us having moral knowledge is very low, or it might even be impossible for us to have moral knowledge. And the reason to think that is that if that's true, then the reason why we form all of our moral beliefs has nothing, the fact that torture is wrong isn't the sort of thing that moves atoms around. And so then our beliefs have nothing to do with the moral facts. And if our beliefs about some domain have nothing to do with the facts about that domain, then we shouldn't trust our beliefs in that domain, like in the example of where you're hallucinating the table. Because the reason you think there's a table has nothing to do with the existence of the table. You have no justification for thinking that there's a table. In this case, because your beliefs about the moral facts on this picture would have nothing to do with the moral facts, then you shouldn't trust you shouldn't trust your beliefs in the moral facts. So the idea is we have moral knowledge, and then that's better explained by theism than by atheism. Okay. When I say we have moral knowledge, I mean we have knowledge of the objective moral facts. We have knowledge of objective facts about what we ought to do.
Okay, that's a good place to segue into, like, just to where we can end here soon. This could be the last topic, but how do you know that these are moral facts? Because it just seems to me like you're ad hoc saying, oh, these are moral facts. Like, not going around and killing everybody is just a moral fact that we know. How do we know that's a moral fact? But even more so, like, that's an extreme example, which I feel like most people in modern society can say, yeah, that's definitely an absolutely abhorrent thing to do. But like what I'm talking about is some of the more nuanced positions. Like, I don't know if you're LGBTQ friendly, but like there's plenty of religious people. Oh, you are. There's plenty of religious people right now that think that God hates the LGBTQ community, and they consider this to be a moral fact. What differentiates your moral facts from other moral facts? Like, how do we know that your particular set of moral facts are the actual moral facts?
Well, I think it's very unlikely that I know all the moral facts. I expect I'm wrong about some some things I think about morality are wrong. Now, I think I'm right probably, most of the time. But I mean, if I were trying to convince a person, like, the way you do morality, you figure out morality, is you start with the way things appear, and then you try to build arguments from really obvious judgments to get to much less obvious conclusions, right? So the reason why most people seem to think that that homosexuality is wrong, generally the reason they think that is because it says so in the Bible. Right. And so then if you are arguing with a person like that and trying to figure out what the moral facts say, obviously, if God exists and is perfectly wise and he really does say that you shouldn't do certain things, then you shouldn't do it. But so then we'd have to figure out, okay, is the Bible the word of God? And if so, is it infallible? And so I'd argue about those things. So that's why I think I'm more likely to be correct than other people, than a person who disagrees. But I mean, it's just sort of the standard way you argue about things. You give reasons. The reasons will involve appealing to plausible principles. The same reasons you believe there's an external world is it appears that there's an external world, or certain things that make the external world likely appear a certain way. And you rely on those appearances to formulate arguments. And then if there's a very controversial conclusion, and if it requires giving up some very obvious things, then you should think the conclusion's almost certainly false.
Can you give me an example of some moral conclusion you've come to that is not a societal norm?
Yeah, I think it's wrong to eat animals. And the reason, right, okay, so then how would I argue for that? Well, what I would argue is, look, it's wrong to cause others vast amounts of pain and suffering for the sake of comparatively minor benefits. And it turns out that eating animals, at least in normal circumstances, does cause others vast amounts of pain and suffering for the sake of comparatively minor benefits. So eating animals in normal circumstances is wrong. And of course, one could disagree with the premise. We could have an argument about it. But that's the basic way you reason about morality. You give arguments from things that are obvious to establish conclusions that people find less obvious.
Is this only applicable to Homo sapiens?
I don't understand the question.
Well, I mean, Homo sapiens being human beings, is this principle of not eating animals and not causing pain, is it only applicable to sentient beings?
Like, are you asking if it's only wrong to eat sentient beings?
No. I'm asking, is it only wrong for sentient beings to eat other organisms?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's wrong in all cases, and there are some cases where I would describe it as bad but not wrong, because I think it only makes sense to describe a being's actions as wrong if they're capable of understanding morality. So if a baby shoots someone, you describe it as bad, but you wouldn't say, baby, you did something super morally wrong, because the baby didn't know any better. But yeah, so I think it would apply to those who can understand morality, and even if for those who can't understand morality, eating animals, in that case, it would nonetheless be bad, but it wouldn't be wrong because they don't understand morality.
Would that mean that it's not morally okay? Or would that mean that it's morally okay for somebody that suffers from psychopathy to not understand that it's wrong to kill another person?
So if a person truly doesn't understand, is a psychopath, and they truly don't understand morality, then I would say what they did was bad, but not wrong. If they really, they just are fundamentally incapable of grasping morality. I don't actually think that's true of psychopaths. I think generally they don't care about morality. They don't, they don't take the moral norms very seriously. But I don't think that they're just like completely ignorant of the moral norms in a way that, for example, a baby is. But if they really were, then yeah, I'd say they didn't, what they did was very bad. And it's, it's unfortunate that it happened. We should lock them up for all sorts of instrumental reasons. But I wouldn't say they did anything wrong, because we only describe it as wrong if a being is capable of understanding morality.
Okay, and what are these normal circumstances that you're saying?
Oh, well, I mean, when I was talking about meat eating, I was just talking about, sort of the circumstances that most of us find ourselves in typically. So, if, suppose today I had considered, going to KFC and buying a thing of chicken. My claim would be doing that. If I had done that, it would have been wrong. I would have been doing something immoral that I oughtn't to have done.
Okay, but like transport yourself 700 years ago, it wouldn't be necessarily wrong to eat animals then.
I think it's less clear. The wrongness, it doesn't have to do with, like, the wrongness of, it has to do with what the act causes, not with, like, the time period you're in. But I think there's a big difference, because right now nearly all meat comes from factory farms, and it's definitely wrong to get meat from a factory farm. If, the animals are sort of living in an idyllic pasture and they wouldn't otherwise exist or something, then it's much less obvious if it's morally wrong. The thing that I was saying is clearly wrong is eating animals, at least in the typical circumstances that most people in the United States find ourselves in. I don't know. We don't need to get super bogged down in this view. You were just asking me for an example of a thing I think about morality that isn't widely accepted. And, that's one thing I think.
Yeah. And I guess the reason why I wanted to go there, and I didn't expect the non-meat eating route to be brought up, but I guess I was just trying to latch on to something that you to substantiate that you think that not eating other organisms, other animals, like, is a moral fact. Like, how do we know that that's a moral fact, other than subjectively you think it's a moral fact, but that doesn't mean that it's a moral fact for everybody?
So my claim is that the way we know that it's a moral fact is we rely on intuitions. And specifically, I think we have the, most people normally, they have the intuition that, well, so, the way I'd substantiate that it's a moral fact is just giving the arguments against meat eating, right? So, there's the one I gave before about you shouldn't cause others vast amounts of pain and suffering. And now, lots of people may think, well, okay, but it's okay to cause others vast amounts of pain and suffering if they're animals, and it's not a big deal. So if they argue that view, I would argue, look, there isn't anything about animals that makes it so that it really is fine to cause them lots of pain and suffering. Just like, animals aren't very smart, but, there are some humans that are severely cognitively enfeebled, but it would be wrong to cause them lots of pain and suffering. It just the sort of standard ways that people do ethics and make ethical arguments is the way that I would do it in pursuit of arguing that meat eating is immoral.
I guess I just still see all this as very subjective to a
But
time, place, and culture.
But I think, okay, so we need to distinguish between two things. One of them is something being context dependent, and one of them being subjective. So something is context dependent if it depends on the circumstances in which one's in, and something is subjective if it depends on what a person believes about it. My claim is, I agree, morality is context dependent, but it's not subjective. So another example of a thing that's context dependent is whether climbing is dangerous. In some cases, climbing is dangerous. Whether climbing is dangerous depends on the context. It's not subjective. It's not like, well, it's only dangerous if you think it's dangerous. That was a kind of weird example, but it's objective. It just depends on the circumstances that you're in. So I agree that morality depends on the circumstances that you're in. Things that might be permissible in one circumstance would be impermissible in another circumstance. But nonetheless,
I feel like that's a distinction without a difference, though.
No, there is a difference. So they're very different things, right? So think about the climbing example. Do you agree that whether or not climbing is dangerous is here's another example. Is falling out of an airplane dangerous? Well, the answer is it's context dependent. If you're skydiving and you have a parachute, then it's not dangerous. But if you don't have one, then it is dangerous.
I'm sorry. I just got to stop you right there. Anytime you're going to jump out of a plane, whether you have a parachute or not, it is still dangerous.
Well, I don't know. I think skydiving is pretty safe, right? I think
people die from skydiving accidents all the time.
But I think it has a lower fatality rate than driving, right?
You're literally jumping out of a plane and you're putting your entire life in the hands of whoever in the fuck packed your pack.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure it has a lower fatality rate than driving. So I think it would be safer than driving. But anyways, the details of the example don't matter. Okay, suppose we ask, is broccoli healthy? Well, that depends on the context. Is the person allergic to broccoli? You could imagine circumstances where broccoli would be unhealthy or something. There are lots of things where whether they're true depends on the context, but nonetheless they're objectively true. It's not like whether broccoli is healthy in some circumstance depends on what you think about it. Nor is it true that whether skydiving is safe in some circumstance depends on what you think about it. Right. So my claim is that, of course, morality depends on the circumstances. In some circumstances, it's wrong to kill people. In other circumstances, it's not wrong to kill people, like in self-defense. It's, of course, context dependent, but my claim is that it's not, it's objective in the sense that it doesn't depend on what people think about it.
Okay. I don't know. I feel like this is just a very roundabout way of defining subjective twice in a row. But, what I'm going to do is I'm definitely going to take, all of this into consideration. I'll probably listen to this back and really think about it. This is the first time I've encountered some of these arguments. The moral argument is something that I'm very familiar with. So, it's going to take a lot for me to budge on that one. But I'll definitely.
I agree that the standard moral argument is no good. My claim is that the moral knowledge argument is the one that's good.
Right, but I guess where I'm left off is that I don't see how us just having the ability to come to moral conclusions inherently means that a God exists, which I think is kind of what you're getting at there. And I just don't see how that actually tracks.
Well, so it's not that us being able to come to moral conclusions, right? You could have lots of people come to conclusions about all sorts of things. It's about our ability to know things about morality. And so
Hold on. So I don't understand the difference. Maybe you can explain it to me about us being able to come to moral conclusions versus knowing moral facts. Like, because I feel like us
Hitler
being
came
able
to
to
moral
come to a moral conclusion, like that's just a more accurate version of saying moral facts, because like you can consider something a moral fact, but it's really just you coming to some kind of moral conclusion.
Well, so to have to have moral knowledge, you need not merely that you come to a conclusion about morality, but that you come to a moral conclusion and you're right in your moral conclusion, right? So Hitler
Yeah, but
had lots
how
of
do you
moral
know that you're
conclusions
right?
that he came to. I think I've explained that. You just do, you do philosophy. You give arguments on both sides. You appeal to premises that are plausible and
Yeah,
use
but
them in
that
support
doesn't
of
actually. I'm sorry for interrupting, but that doesn't actually like show that you're right. Like these philosophical arguments, it's not like some kind of like hard fact that you're right about this. You can justify it, sure, but that doesn't mean that you're correct about it.
Okay, suppose I were to ask you, well, so the claim is that the way we know that there are moral facts, the moral facts, their existence doesn't depend on us. But the reason why it's a good bet to think probably there are moral facts, and the way that we come to conclude that there are moral facts is by employing philosophical arguments. We look at what's obvious, and then we come to conclusions where we start with what's obvious and then use that to derive things that are less obvious.
Right, but my contention is that what's obvious to one person is going to be different than what's obvious to another person.
But that doesn't tell you anything about whether it's objective, right? Like,
I mean, that means it's inherently subjective. Like
no,
that would be
subjective
that would
people
define it
believe.
as subjective.
To say something is objective isn't to say that everyone agrees about it, right? Like, it's
I
objectively the case
know.
that the Big Bang happened, even though lots of people disagree about whether the Big Bang happened. They're just wrong. And my claim is, if you think that
They're wrong because of evidence.
yeah, and I think in the moral case, people are wrong because of evidence. Now, that evidence, it'll take the form of intuitions, right? So there are certain obvious moral conclusions that, like, that it's wrong to torture people, and
Well,
they're
no.
wrong.
I mean, so like for the Big Bang example here, I mean, it's not just our intuition that the Big Bang is correct. Like we have a picture of the Big Bang. Like we've got a picture of the inflation of the
Yeah, but
universe.
if you want to, the philosophical backdrop ideas that you're relying on to come to that picture and to conclude that the Big Bang happened at all, those are the sorts of things that you come to based on intuitions and the way that things appear, right? So in order to think the Big Bang happened, you have to think that there's an external world, and to think that there's an external world, you're going to have to rely on the way that things appear.
I mean, all I have to rely on is the evidence that's right in front of me. Like that's
But if you're a brain in a vat and you're hallucinating all that evidence, then the Big Bang didn't really happen.
well, see, I circumvent the hard solipsism route by just saying we are presented with a universe, we're presented with a reality, we experience it, and what that's all we have to work with. So it's really pointless to propose a brain in the vat idea.
But, well, do you think that you know that you're not a brain in a vat?
I would say that I know that I'm experiencing reality as it exists right now, whether whether that's a cleverly devised like matrix situation where I'm a brain in a vat, or if it's not. I'm saying that it doesn't matter as far as my conclusions go.
Okay, doesn't matter as far as your conclusions go. So you don't. So just to be clear, your position, it seems to be, you don't know that you're not a brain in a vat, but it doesn't really matter. You don't. It's not the sort of thing that you need to know, because all the things that matter are the things that have experimentally detectable consequences. So even if we're brains in vats, it doesn't really matter. But I would say no. I know I'm not a brain in a vat. I know that evolution happened. I'm not just a brain in a vat hallucinating a world that looks like evolution happened. No, I think I know that evolution happened. I know that the Big Bang happened. I know that Julius Caesar existed.
Yes, but you know all of that because of the evidence that undoubtedly points to those things actually happening.
No, but so I agree that there's evidence that points to that, but the evidence will, at base, be based on the way that things seem to us and the way that things appear to us, right? So here's a theory that explains all the evidence. The universe began in 1995 in exactly the state it was, that we believe it was in 1995, and then since then has just played out according to plan. That explains all the data, right? That explains all the facts that have happened after 1995. It's perfectly consistent with all your experiences.
Right, and it's unfalsifiable, and therefore is just, a pointless thing to even posit or bring up because it's
Well, my
unfalsifiable.
claim is that I know that it's false, and the way
How?
that I, because it's less simple, it's less parsimonious, and that it violates the way that things appear. Where the way that things
How
appear
is
is
it
that
less simple in the way that you view simplicity? I mean, it seems pretty simple to me. Everything was created as it was in 1995, and that's just how things have
because
existed. And there's no evidence whatsoever that it was created in 1995.
the reason why it's simpler is that, or sorry, less simple is that the things in 1995 were in this very complicated state. There were all these particles, distributed in the smear across the universe, and so in order to fully describe all of the states of the universe in the year 1995, that's very complex to do. But I mean, sorry, how do
And
you
God couldn't
think
have done that?
God could have done that? But right, so maybe God, but I think God has a bias towards creating simpler worlds, and I think that God would have a reason not to make us radically deceived about the nature of the world, so he wouldn't make
I
a.
I would just have to ask how you know all of this stuff about God. Like I
Well,
mean, you can have subjective like conclusions as to how you would know, but I feel like you're ultimately just ad hoc stating God would prefer this.
so I mean, the reason to think that God would prefer this is if God is perfectly good and massively deceiving billions of people is a bad thing to do, then God would have a moral reason not to massively deceive billions of
I
people.
mean, I don't know that it would be bad. Like it would not be good for God to massively deceive everybody. Like
Well,
that seemed to
okay,
be
so
like a complicated conclusion to come to.
we're going to come back to, I think it appears that way, certainly. And I think you should trust that, things appear. Uh, um, yeah, you should trust that things are the way that they appear. So if it appears that God wouldn't, that a perfect being would have a reason not to massively deceive us, then you should think that God would not massively deceive us. Now, but I mean, the point is, I think so. What you're saying is, well, we know that the Big Bang happened, we know that evolution happened, we know that Julius Caesar, we know all these things that I agree, of course, that we know because of evidence. But my claim is that all that evidence relies on trusting that our sense experiences tells us about the way the world really is. And for that conclusion, that's the conclusion that you can't conclude is right through empirical evidence. You can only conclude that that conclusion is right through philosophical argument that on the way that things appear.
Okay. Well, I definitely will chew on all of this. We do have a few super chats to address, which if there's anybody out there that wants to send in a super chat over here on the Godless Engineer channel, or over, I don't know if you're monetized yet. But I've got some starred, and we kind of give preference to the super chats over here. We've got Sonic Shroom who asked at the very beginning of the show there. Simple is a comparative argument. To assess if the universe is complex or simple would require another universe to compare it with.
No, I don't think that's true. So, I think, for example, that it's very unlikely that there's going to be an elephant that pops into my room uncaused 1 minute from now, because if on the theory that it will, that's a much more complicated theory. You have to write into the fundamental laws, one that makes an elephant. You don't need to compare it to another universe in order to come to the conclusion that like an elephant popping into my room is improbable. Right. All you need is just an analysis of, it requires extra stuff, so it's less simple.
But wouldn't it be good for God to pop an elephant into your room?
No. Well, I don't think so, because remember, my claim is that every possible person exists in some universe, right? So whatever elephant he might put in my room, that elephant already exists somewhere in the multiverse, right? And that elephant's, hopefully grazing on greener pastures, hopefully in a much nicer place than my room for an elephant to be.
Well, but I mean, what if it's in another universe where the elephant did pop up in your room? You're just not in the universe where it popped in your room.
Wait, I don't understand. I mean, maybe there are some my claim is that it's very improbable that an elephant would pop into my room.
Yeah, but I mean, of course, I would come back and say, well, you're not saying that it's 0% that would happen. So
Yeah,
there's there's just
maybe
very low.
maybe somewhere in the multiverse, an elephant pops into my room, but probably not here. So it's low so it's low probability, or because it's low probability.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah.
Where do you want me to send it so you can pull it up?
Oh, what's that? Sorry. My wife was telling me she needs to send me something. So we'll get to that here in a second. Next up is my wife, Caitlin Chloe, who says, can Matthew please define or describe his God and beliefs surrounding it? What kind of God, and is there a heaven and hell element? What elements of Christianity are in it, etc.? Thanks.
Sure. So the definition of God is a perfect being, a being that's unlimited in power, knowledge, goodness, and that created the universe. My beliefs surrounding it are, fairly minimal. I think, a lot of it's mysterious. In terms of what kind of God, like, perfect one, as I described, heaven and hell. I think there's a good afterlife. And the reason to think this is, if God's perfect, right, it would be kind of cruel and malicious to snuff us out after this life. So I expect an infinitely good postmortem of existence, for sort of the same reason that I expect an infinitely good postmortem existence. Unlike Christians, I don't think that, if you have the wrong beliefs about God, you'll burn forever or anything like that. And to be clear, lots of Christians don't think that. And I actually think the scriptural case for that is quite weak. In terms of elements of Christianity, I mean, similar in some respects, different in others. I don't think God is a Trinity, nor raised Jesus from the dead. Hopefully that was clear.
I'm sorry, what was your follow-up?
What makes him think God is perfect? That's like, it seems to be his underlying assumption.
Yeah. So what's your argument for thinking that God is perfect?
Oh, so the idea is that if you think, so what we want is a simple theory that explains the evidence. So one way to get a very simple theory that explains the evidence is you say that God has just one fundamental property without limits, right? Because the theory, if it's just one property and it has no limits, then it's just simple and lacks arbitrary limits. So my claim is, if you think that God is a perfect being, then he instantiates just one fundamental property, which is perfection, and then that explains all his properties. Actually, I think perfection is not the best example of the fundamental property when I think God has. I think the best way to think of it is God is this unlimited mind. So, just as it would be a limit on the mind if there's something that it can't do or something that it doesn't know, God doesn't have any limits like that. And then because he fully understands all the moral facts and sort of sees vividly that he ought to act in accordance with them, he would be motivated to act in accordance with them because he doesn't have any contradictory desires. So it's both more parsimonious, and then it better explains the data, where you don't get an explanation of, for example, fine-tuning, unless you think that God, that if you think there's a perfect God who wants to make universes that support valuable forms of life, then it explains why there's fine-tuning. Similarly, if you think that the anthropic argument I was giving, where you say God would create every possible person, or at least the same cardinality of people as there are possible people, that's best explained. If God's perfect, then it makes sense. It makes sense that he would do that. But if God just has some random arbitrary set of desires, or is limited in his power, then it's much less likely he would do that. There are other points, but those are some of them.
Would you say that he has unlimited phenomenal power, but a very tiny living space?
I think he's non-physical, so I guess he does have very tiny limited space, and infinite phenomena. Yeah, good way of putting it.
Have you seen Aladdin?
No.
No. So in the Aladdin movie, the cartoon from 1990 something or another, old as fuck. Robin Williams has this one part where he's like, he's the genie in it, and he's like, I have unlimited phenomenal cosmic power, and then he shrinks down into his lamp, and he's like, tiny living space. So
I see.
Yeah.
I see. That's funny.
Yeah, I was sorry. That's where my brain went. I've got a Joker brain, and I'm old. Yes, honey, I'm old. I'm 40. Almost. And then from Twitch, which we're simultaneously streaming over there on Twitch, we got Sansa Bark, who asks, so at the moment of the Big Bang, the universe was the size of a singularity and also of infinite size?
Well, at the singularity, I think the idea is that it was infinitely compressed, but then after the singularity, it was infinite size.
So it instantaneously. So we're not currently inflating now.
We are inflating in the sense that any 2 points are getting further apart, but it's still infinite in size. So when physicists talk about inflating, what they mean is the points are getting further apart, even if both before and after it, it's still infinite. Infinity has very weird properties, and you might think intuitively that sort of like if you spread everything apart, it would get bigger, but that turns out to not be how it works. And the idea that it is how it works ends up being indefensible.
Well, I mean, I guess it seems a bit contradictory there for it to be both expanding but also infinitely infinite in size. But like I said,
Well,
I'm
I
going to
was
chew
explaining
this
why that
over.
isn't a contradiction, because when you talk about it being expanding in size, what you mean is any 2 points are getting further apart, not that like the circumference is greater, right? There isn't a circumference, it's infinite. I don't know why I said circumference, I meant area. I guess it would also apply. Anyways.
Right. Like I said, I'm gonna have to chew on this because this is the first time that I've heard like some of these arguments. So I do appreciate you coming over here. For anybody that is over on Matthew's channel, if you care to come over here and see what I've got going on, it's just Godless Engineer here on YouTube. Anywhere else too, even over there on Twitch. I don't know if anybody watches Twitch, but I'm over there as well. Oh yeah. Well, I do have to say that for a brief moment, and one of my audience was actually able to capture this. Hold on. Just got to pull it up. It's something really quick that I think is really going to blow your mind about what we were saying just a few moments ago. No. Now, I don't know if you know, but for a moment, God popped an elephant in right behind you. And then by the time you turned back around, it was just gone. So
yeah, I guess you'd have to you need video camera to catch it because it was for such a brief period of time. That's funny.
Pixar didn't happen is no longer viable, huh?
Yeah.
Sorry. Some good. It was a good conversation tonight, and I mean, I don't know if I got too heated at some points.
No,
I tried not to.
I thought you were fine. Yeah, and I agree that it was a good conversation.
Awesome, great. Well,
yeah,
Matthew, I hope you. Yeah. Hold on. I'm so sorry. You need to show yourself. Tell everybody where they can find you and everything like that.
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions, that you can find if you type into Google Deliberation Under Ideal Conditions. I also have a blog called Bentham's Newsletter that you can find if you type into Google either Bentham's Bulldog or Bentham's Newsletter. I guess on my channel, many of the things I've said here, sort of like, because I didn't want to give, a 45-minute lecture, I provided only the briefest of summaries of them. But so I'll link to where I go into more detail about the arguments that I give. I think in particular, the anthropic argument, it's a very weird one and it's hard to get your head around. And so I think, it can sound very silly when you say it at first. But there are lots of philosophers who I've talked to about it who take the argument quite seriously. So I think, it's at least worth thinking about, even though it's pretty confusing. But yeah, so thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I've enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry. I know I had cut you off a second ago. Was there something else that you wanted to add?
No, that was it.
Okay. All right, cool. Awesome. Well, it was great talking to you. I'm glad that we were able to connect up like this, and maybe we can connect up sometime in the future and maybe talk about some of the other arguments that you had, because I genuinely had a good time discussing these very deep philosophical like arguments, and it's given me a lot to chew on. So sure. Definitely appreciate that.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I've enjoyed the discussion, and I'd be happy to have one again sometime. Yeah. Take care.
Awesome. All right. If you can, just hold on. Don't leave out just yet, because the uploads on your end have to complete. I'm going to see everybody later. There's not going to be a stream tomorrow night here on my channel. I normally do one on Friday nights. because we're going to be going to the Kentucky Free Thought Convention. And yes, that's ironically called the KFC. It's held in Kentucky, so that is even better. But we're going to be going there. So we're going to be up there Friday and Saturday. And then Sunday, I'm on the Atheist Experience. And so that'll be fun. And then next week, we've got some more conversations with people that I had over there on the TikToks. So if you will, please go down below, visit the links that we got for Matthew here, as well as for my stuff down there. And I guess we will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.